So back in spring, I bought this bike, a 2016 Kona Process 153DL, and it's pretty close to my dream bike. It's about as close as I can get to the numbers I want, but it did have some shortcomings. And I wasn't going to make necessarily a whole video or bike check about it because given the age of this bike, not only is it not something I expect others to go out of their way to buy, but you might not even be able to find it, or I think realistically I wouldn't always recommend it because it has the previous standard shock sizing, the previous standard through axle sizing, among other things that make it just a little bit harder to service and maintain going forward, or just find replacement parts. And so far I've absolutely loved this bike, especially for my kind of riding. It feels basically like a BMX bike or a dirt jumper with suspension in the rear. It's definitely taken a little bit of effort and money to keep it running as an older bike. I replaced the shock to get a bit more effective lockout. I ended up feeling like I had to replace the front wheel in its entirety because the rim design on that older bike just really wasn't great for tubeless setup, especially with really tight and strong modern like downhill tubeless tires. So I did the whole front wheel, did the tires Continental front and back, and then I did a new pad and rotor up front, as well as the basics of like pedals and saddle or whatever. But other than that, the bike's been great. I've experimented with bar a little bit just to make it even more BMXy, but the bike really is great in its stock config. Just might be hard to keep up going forward. And so while I can't quite recommend this exact bike due to the age and some of those difficult parts and servicing, I can, however, recommend this bike, the Kona Process 153 from 2023, the modern version of my old bike. So about 8 years difference, but for the most part, not necessarily 8 years worth of change. They've been very incremental about it and kind of kept that original concept of the 153 alive, especially for the 275 model. It's still a pretty jibby bike, and it still kind of feels like a BMX bike with suspension, but not quite anymore. So for me, one of the biggest changes is obviously going from the 425 to the 430 chainstay. Doesn't seem like a lot, but especially when you add in some of the other changes, it really does turn that wheelbase longer, and it just gives you less of that control, less of that pop, or less of the things that I'm looking for out of a bike. So it feels less like a BMX or a dirt jumper. So the head tube angle goes from 66.5 on the 2016 to 64.5, which is definitely, it's arguably even past the all mountain trail category. That's basically an enduro number. And to a certain extent, that does extend the wheelbase out to where it feels more like an enduro bike. It feels long and planted and stable. But the one major upside of this bike that led me to even bothering upgrading when that bike is so good and perfectly fine is that the seat tube angle is now 77 degrees as opposed to a very wallowy 74 degrees. And when you put 77 degrees with a 430 chainstay, it gets even better, whereas if you put a 74 slack seat tube angle with a 425 chainstay, especially at my weight, you literally start to feel like you're wheeling up the hill, falling off the back of the bike, and it's not very comfortable even on the flatter fire road climbs. Now, obviously, being 8 years different, there's been some changes in the lengthening of the bike. My old 2016 Process for a large is 460 reach. This bike is 480 reach. Whereas if I were to get this modern one in a medium, it would be 455. So my 2016 Kona Process, numbers wise, is actually closer to a modern medium or small. Also, my old Kona has a stack height of 605. This large is 625. The medium would be 615. And the small that my girlfriend got is exactly 605. So stack wise, the large 2016 and the 2023 size small are the same. And of course for wheelbase, you're gonna see similar changes. The old bike is 1190, the new bike is 1243 for large. So we're looking at nearly a 50 millimeter increase. A medium wheelbase would be 1213, and a small wheelbase would be 1184. Once again, very close to my 2016 large's 1190 wheelbase. Now all the geometry aside, which is okay, it is weird to go from the deluxe edition of the 2016 and this base model of the 153-275, which isn't offered in a deluxe edition anymore, and it's not even offered in carbon these days. So if you want this bike, the 153-275, what kit are you basically forced to get? Well, it's actually a pretty good kit. The fork is a Yari, which is basically a heavier, damper, downgraded version of a Lyric like you might find on my 2016. The shocks is just that deluxe shock with the plus lockout on it. And considering I opted to change the sort of super deluxe, well, that would be the Monarch back then, but the piggyback version of the shock, which had effectively no lockout, this shock is actually quite good, and I wouldn't really change it. On the old 2016 model, you have that 11-speed SRAM XO, which is really good for that time, and honestly, still holds up today. And on the new Process, you have the Shimano Dior 11-speed, which is probably exactly the drivetrain I'd want if you're buying in this price range. 12-speed can be nice, but when you look at the numbers, it's not that different. It really depends on your lower end and which chainring you want to run, but otherwise, I'd prefer the 11-speed Dior. Brakes-wise is the only thing that did kind of bother me, where I will actually be going for an upgrade, whereas for the most part, I don't feel like I need to upgrade this bike. On the old bike, you have the Dior XT 2-piston, but it has those really nice Dior XT levers. And on this bike, you have the MT 420 brake calipers, which are quite nice, but they give you those base sort of MT 401 or 201 levers. Basically, they're cheaper levers. And while they're very functional and serviceable for newer riders, that's something I'd want to upgrade. And it's kind of interesting because given that that bike could use new calipers and 4-piston from 2-piston, and this bike could use new levers to go from the cheap levers to at least MT 501s, that means I can just buy basically an MT 520 set, 4-piston with the upgraded lever, and throw the calipers over there and throw the levers on here. Upgrade both bikes at the same time. So as of right now, I'm not actually planning to get rid of my old Kona. In fact, having this Kona as my sort of trail bike or my all-around bike, especially for tech stuff, it kind of opens the door to do some of the funkier things that I was hoping to do with the old Kona. Given that it's such a jump bike, a BMX bike, it almost feels like a slope bike, so maybe I'll make it one. Maybe I'll take off the dropper, throw a rigid seat post, and convert the drivetrain to single speed and just have 2 brake levers on the bars. But I guess it would be a bad idea to do all that before we actually test ride the bike. So let's take this thing out and see how it feels.